Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I think we are ready to get started. So welcome. As we gather today to talk about women's rights in Morocco, I want to start by acknowledging that today is Inauguration Day, and the United States will officially have the first woman vice president in its history. It is a moment to be celebrated for sure, but also cause for reflection. The US considers itself a leader in the world, an example of freedom and opportunity. Yet since 1960, 57 countries have been led by a woman. That's 30% of the countries in the world. As we stress in our Immersion Projects program, we in the United States have a lot to learn from others around the world. Perhaps 4 years from today, the US will be inaugurating its first woman president. This is the third of 4 sessions called Storytelling for Social Change, which all feature partners with whom the Center for Public Service plans immersion projects. As we planned this series, we had a formal description of what we wanted to do, complete with learning objectives. But informally, to those we were inviting, we said we hoped they could take commonly held beliefs, informed by the media or whatever, and turn them on their head. Tell us stories that will help us see topics in a completely new way. That is exactly what happened to me when I visited Morocco last January and met Farah Sharif Douaizan, who is today's speaker. Farah is the General Director of the Center for Cross-Cultural Learning, which she founded in 1995. CCCL is located in the beautiful Medina of Rabat and offers language courses, study abroad experiences, and other cultural and educational opportunities. In fact, if you as a Gettysburg College student study abroad in Morocco, which would be a very good decision, there's a great chance you would be studying at CCCL. Farah's academic interest and research is in comparative religion, and she teaches on Islam from a cross-cultural perspective, women and gender issues, Islam and human rights, and Sufism in Morocco. She is publishing her first book about her more than 25 years in cross-cultural education from the hosting perspective. And I can attest that she is a great host, as I learned a great deal from her lectures and from our time eating together. I'm so pleased that she's able to be here today and share her stories and her wisdom with us. Welcome, Farah.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody. Hi, guys. Congratulations on the new president, and especially new woman vice president. I'm sure that this is a big thing, and for everybody, not only you, for us too. Okay, so the way I want to start this lecture first, what I want you to see is the background that I have. The background, I'm going to move a little bit so you can see the photo quite well. This is the building where the Center for Cross-Cultural Learning is located. And the reason why I wanted to have this as a background is because when I'll be talking to you about Morocco, most of what I will be saying you will have to imagine is happening in an architecture like the one that you see on the photo behind me. So I just wanted to put you a little bit into this environment so I can make you dream a little bit and think about all the things that were happening in homes and places like this. The second thing I wanted to say is, please, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourselves and just ask the question. I'll be very happy to answer as many questions as possible. We will have time for questions at the end, but just in case you feel like there's something you didn't understand, you need more clarification, or you have a concern about, just stop me. I'll be very happy to answer them. If I feel like we need to wait until the end, I'll let you know, but I hope you can understand that. So the other thing I wanted to do is tell you who I am, and not from an academic perspective, but from a human perspective. I am a Muslim Moroccan woman. I could say I'm a woman, Moroccan, Muslim. I could say I'm Moroccan, woman, Muslim, whatever you want. But what does it mean? Very often when we think about Morocco, we think about the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. Quite often for us, Morocco is an Arab country. Very often for us, Morocco is a Muslim country. And we forget at times that Morocco is also in Africa. And I want to insist here on saying that as Moroccans, we have all those discussions and issues with our identities. But I want you to know that anything I'm going to speak about will be somehow speaking about a country that is a melting pot of several layers. So yes, Islam is the main religion of the country, but Judaism is also a religion in Morocco. As a Moroccan, you're either born Muslim or a Jew. If you are a Christian Moroccan, then you've converted to it. You were not born into it very often, because Christianity did not make it as a religion in Morocco, the same way Judaism was in Morocco before even Islam, and Islam then in the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century, made it to Morocco. But also because Morocco is African, you have animism, you have different other African religions. Now, the truth is the majority of Moroccans are Muslims, but the way we practice Islam is sometimes very different from other countries because of our Africanity, but also because of our relationship with Judaism, or the fact that Morocco is also a Jewish country. And you'll see it when you come to Morocco, you feel it. Yes, it's predominantly Muslim, but Judaism is there. The other thing about Morocco that's important, it is an African country, but it is most importantly a North African country. And why do I say this? It's because North Africa means that people are Amazigh, Berber. The correct term is Amazigh, Amazigh, which is the correct name for the Berbers. The more than 50% of the Moroccan population is originally from the Berber descent. When you say that we are Berber, it's not a racial difference, it's an ethnic difference. It doesn't show in our features, it doesn't show in anything. It only shows sometimes in our family names. And even then, our family names could, you could recognize where this person is from, which tribe this person belongs to. Maybe this tribe was a Berber tribe or was an Arab tribe, but sometimes this tribe was Berber but then got Arabized, or this tribe was Arab and get Berberized. It's very confusing. The reason I'm saying all this to you now is to say that it's not as white and black, as clear and as one would think. Morocco is a confusing country. Its architecture is confusing, its ethnicity is confusing, everything could be confusing, but it's a very interesting country, even though it's not a very big country. Now, when I say I'm a Muslim woman, I also belong to a country where women as Muslim women used to be considered confined to homes. And the homes where these women were confined when they were living in the cities are very much like the house that is behind me. I'll move again. Which means it's a space that has very high ceilings. In the past, it was open to the sky, and it would have pillars, and it would have long rooms where people would live together. Different families would live together. Most often, they were related to each other, so the extended family will live there. Sometimes it'll be polygamous families, because at the time, up till mid-20th century, there were still quite a lot of polygamous families living there. Or it would be people would be sharing a house. More recently, they would be sharing a house like this. The house would have a courtyard in the middle, which would be for everybody, and then for everybody, all the families living together. And the rooms would be the private spaces for every nuclear, what we would call today the nuclear family. So I come from a country where I am a city woman, and because I'm a city woman, I lived in an architecture that's very similar to the one you see in the building. By the way, the CCCL building did not belong to my family. This building is in Rabat, which is the capital city of Morocco. And I'm from Tangier in the north of Morocco. So it's not, the architecture is the same, but it does not belong to the family. The reason why I wanted to introduce you to this is because there are times in my life where I feel I have lived for over 100 years. I know I'm older than you guys, but I'm not that old. Believe me, I'm not over 100 years old. I may sound like this when I'll be talking to you and narrating to you the lives of my ancestors, family, grandmothers, etc. But you will not, but believe me, I have not known those who are who were living in the 19th century. I did not know them. It also feels, my life also feels sometimes like when you're studying the theory of Darwin, the theory of evolution, Darwinism, at school, and then you come home and your faithful parents are telling you that creation is actually from God and that God created Adam and Eve. And then you go to school, and in school they tell you, Adam and Eve, we don't know, but what Darwin told us is the truth about creation. It could be schizophrenic, it could be confusing, it could be somehow, you know, it would mean that it is contradictory, but the truth is this is how I lived my life. And this is how a lot of Moroccan people, young women included, and older women, my age, have lived their lives. But instead of confusing us or confusing me, it actually enriched me. It made me think. And in my family, I was told what Darwin said is science and it's taught in school. And what God has said is faith, and you get it at home. So that's basically how we are. The way we live at home, the way we live in the school, the way we behave with our siblings, sometimes are very different, especially in my generation. And having said that, and having introduced a little bit of this confusing moments or part of my life, I want to speak about, narrate to you 3 generations of women. And in those 3 generations of women, I want to explain to you the changes that have happened in women's lives in this country. I will focus more on city women, but I will speak about the countryside because it's a very important part of Morocco, especially that up till the end of the 20th century, the majority of people in Morocco lived in the countryside. And a smaller number lived in the cities. When we speak about cities, when we speak about Moroccan history, we speak about pre-colonial time, colonial time, and then post-colonial time. Pre-colonial time is before 1912. Colonial time is from 1912 to 1956. And then post-colonial time is after that, up till today. Before colonial time, the majority of Moroccans lived in the countryside, and the only cities or urban settings that existed are what we call the Medina, Medina. The Medinas were walled cities that have been built, you know, thousands of years ago, or hundreds of years ago, I'm sorry, centuries ago, and they have been built by Muslims when they came to Morocco in the 8th century. Then in the colonial time, when the French settled in Morocco and colonized Morocco, they actually built outside of the walled cities. And their politics was to keep the Moroccans, Jews and Muslims, inside their walled cities and build the new cities, what they call the modern cities of Morocco, la ville nouvelle in French. They built them outside of the walls of the cities, but very close to the walls. And then they decided that the countryside of Morocco is only which is the majority of the country, would be the space to get what we need to consume. So farmers and agriculturals and fishermen, people who would be the workers for the benefit of the modern country, which is the French country. And after the French left Morocco, we found ourselves with a country that is a little bit of everything, a little bit of the pre-colonial time, a little bit of the colonial time, and facing a future that was starting to change. So my grandmother, who was born in the beginning of the 20th century, 1906, and died in 2002. She was 96 years of age when she died. This grandmother from my father's side lived in a house like the building that you see behind me. And for 96 years, she could count the number of times she left her home in her whole life. And it meant for her time that she did not need to go out. And like everything we could think of today as women, especially when we see Kamala Harris doing golf and Kamala Harris being the vice president, and me talking to you and you going to school and all those things. In the time of my grandmother, women did not go to school. As a matter of fact, even men, very few men would go to school. Only those, the learners, would be those who would read the Quran, explain the laws for people. So a very small minority was required to study. But the majority of Moroccans were farmers or people who were sellers. They would learn how to count, but they were not expected to know how to study. When the French left Morocco, 96% of the women population was illiterate, 96%. And all this in 1960, the statistics of 1960, which is frightening. But so my grandmother was among the women of her time, never went to school, did not go out of her house. My grandmother was also considered to be a lucky woman of her time, because it means she did not need to work like women in the countryside who would have to work in order to help their husbands, or they would have to do some housework. But she was the lucky woman because of that, but also because she married her cousin. And I'm normal, just so you know, so far. So by marrying her cousin, it meant that she stayed in the family and that her uncle and her father have chosen for her the best situation possible, instead of giving her away to another family or to a different tribe where she might not be respected and taken care of. She was kept in the family in order for her to reproduce for her own family, extended family. Again, what I'm trying to say is giving you this perspective of the time of my grandmother, which for me, not let alone for you, was something very difficult to understand in the beginning. So I see that for most of you, if not all of you, it'll be very difficult to understand how come that she will be lucky. She didn't go out. A woman who could count the number of times she went out of her house meant that she did not need to do it, that she was lucky, that she had decent men surrounding her, taking care of her. When my grandfather died, my father, my uncles, her brothers-in-law, her brothers, everybody was taking care of her. So she was a lucky woman of her time. By being a lucky woman of her time and by being home, very often we believe that these women were forced to stay home. I would say that in my generation, we would consider that these women were forced to stay home. But at the same time, I can tell you how my grandmother lived her life and what was her role. My grandmother was the matriarch. We very often, when we speak about the Islamic world and our part of the world, we speak about patriarchy. We never speak about matriarchy. But in our case, both exist. The matriarch is in charge of the inside, and the patriarch is in charge of the outside. The clear-cut division of how the space is being used by men and women existed up till the time when the French colonized Morocco. For my grandmother and people of her time, it was clear, it was fine, and there was no question about it. Women were the ones who make decisions inside of their homes, and men were the ones who make decisions outside of the home. I remembered that when my grandfather was coming home in a house like the one behind me, my grandfather was not allowed inside of his house until permission was given him by my grandmother or the women who were in charge. But it was very often my grandmother telling them when he can come in and from what is the direction and the itinerary he should take in his house. In fact, my grandfather would stay, and I'm going to share my screen with you guys because I want you to see photos of the space that of the house, like, you know, one of the spaces. I'm just trying to, oops, okay, what am I doing? I'm trying to, okay. I'm going to share this with you in a minute, if I can. Okay, yeah, here. This is it. I don't know if you are able to see it. Yeah, here. Okay. Are you able to see it?
Yes, we can see that.
Great. So this is the entrance of the center, actually, of the CCCL, but it's very similar to entrances of homes in Morocco, in the Medinas of Morocco, old cities of Morocco. So can you see the little, you see when I move the cursor, yeah? So my grandfather would enter from this main door in the house and will have to sit on this little wall and wait until permission was given him to enter the house. Very often, a man was not allowed in what is called the heart of the house, which is the courtyard that you see behind me. He would have to take a back door, which is the door that you see just next to the main entrance. He would take stairs to go up or go around, but he would not be allowed to get into the heart of the house except on special occasions when there was a wedding or music or something. And then the men were the only ones accepted in the courtyard in order for the women to be upstairs. If you see behind me the photo, all those balconies upstairs, this is where women would be, and they would look from upstairs down in the men, and the men could not lift their heads to see them. So anyway, my grandfather would enter from here. He would wait here. When I was a child, I was among the little kids, the grandchildren, who were asked to go and open the door, but keep entertaining the grandfather until the grandmother decides when it was okay for him to come in. I cannot tell you how long it took, but sometimes it took very long because poor man, he was tired. He would wait, and then she would make the decision. And when he was finally allowed in the house where he would be, in the room where he would be sitting, he then, this is the courtyard. So this is the middle of the house, where here it was one of our last one of our meetings as staff members. But this courtyard would be the place where women would be hanging around in the time of my grandmother, and men would not be allowed. And then this is a view from above of the courtyard. So women will be, wandering around in the house freely. But the men would have to, for instance, my father would come and enter this room and would sit there and would not be allowed not only to wander around, but not even to go to the bathroom without the permission of my grandmother. And these are things we don't speak about. We only speak about Muslim and Arab women being confined to their homes and not being able to go out, which is true. But the other side of the story is what we never say. The other side, and I'm a witness of history, the other side, and I'm not the only one, the other side of the story is the fact that women had so much authority inside the homes to the extent that men prefer to stay outside of their houses. So when my grandfather was getting old and retired, he felt so much, he felt that he lost his power of the patriarch because he had to spend more time inside his house, which meant that he was at the mercy of my grandmother, basically, and of the women. And they were the ones to allow him in and from one place to the other. A man was not allowed in the kitchen, and a man was not allowed in the terraces of homes like this. And all of them had beautiful and huge terraces. But the terraces were for women only. It was a kind of a garden, but it was also a way for them to communicate with each other. So women would meet on the roofs of their terraces and speak and invite each other to visit each other, etc. So that was the situation. And I remembered again, my grandfather having a little bell that he will ring every time he needed something, so someone would come. So you would say he was being served, etc. But the truth is that there was this clear-cut division between public and private space that needed to be respected. So that's my grandmother and my grandmother time. The other thing about my grandmother is that women in her time were not taught how to practice religion, because religion was considered men's matter. And they were very often told that God had more important things to do than to listen to a woman praying. Now, the thing that people forget to say is that whatever I'm telling you about my grandmother was true for the Moroccan Jews. The Jews also were confined, women were staying home and men were out. What I like to say about my grandfather, I like to use the term being confined in one place inside the house. So if women were considered to be confined in their homes, the men were actually confined to one place in the house and were not able. I don't think my grandfather knew much about how his house looked like, maybe when he bought it, or maybe that's it. I don't think he knew much about what was happening in the house. And I think this is quite interesting. Now, this is how a room would look like. So the rooms were quite long and they would have sofas everywhere. In this case, we are having, this is a living room where we are having small tables because that's how it should be. And then normally people have rugs on the floor. We like to have rugs on the walls, but that's how a house would be. And people would sit around and they would put those tables, round tables, so they would sit there, eat there, meet there. So it's a living room, it's an eating room, it's everything. And that's how I grew up, coming from school to my grandmother's home, because we had to visit our grandparents every day. And when we visit them every day, it was great for us because we didn't have to do homework right away after coming from school, which our parents would, be much more. So my grandmother was like this. And she married, as I said, her cousin. She married in the family. I wanted to also show you the architecture of a village. So I'm not only speaking about the cities. So you can see still thick walls, high ceilings, the same thing. So women in the countryside would also be in homes. They would also be in charge of household duties. But the difference is in the countryside, if you need running, there was no running water. So if you need water, you have to go to the well. If you want to wash the clothes, you have to go to the river. If you need to eat, you have to milk the cow. So there were a lot of duties that were part of the household duties that actually extended outside of the physical walls of the house. Therefore, they were going out, but not necessarily doing, like they would not go shopping. They would not just go and hang around. They cannot do that. They could go out only to complete the household duties that they were in charge of. So it's quite interesting. It's not the same thing. This is a view of a house in the cities where you have a fountain in the middle, which some houses have, and some houses even have trees, as you could see. And then this is what a woman would be doing inside her house during the day. After she's done the household duties, she'll be sewing, she'll be doing embroidery. She might be even selling her products, but she's not the one going out doing it. She either has people, women, coming home and buying from her, or she will have a man, her husband, her son, her brother, someone who would be taking this to the market and selling it. They could be making also carpets, etc. So you could see that everything about the tiles and marble, etc., and also the couches on the floor. All this is the art that was considered very important art in the most of the countries in our region. This is a photo of my grandmother that I'm speaking about. I just thought it'd be interesting for you to see how they dressed. So my grandmother and the woman next to her is her cousin. They were about the same age. And both of them, you could see, had a different hairstyle. And the reason, and even though they're wearing those beautiful kaftans and nice dresses, etc., with a lot of embroidery, women would spend hours taking care of themselves and how they look. In our case, it's only when we go out. We stay with our pajamas inside our houses. I have never seen my grandmother in her pajamas. And I'm telling you, she died in 2002, which means I've known her quite well. And both of them were taking good care, but the style was different because every woman had her style in terms of how they would tie their scarves over their heads. You could see some hair for the cousin, but you cannot see any hair, or almost any, for my grandmother. Now, in the very few times when they were going outside of their homes, they had to cover the dress. They would wear like the equivalent of a coat in today's terminology. And before I tell you this, and this is what they would wear when they go out. So this is a hayik. Again, both Muslims and Jews would be wearing the same thing when they go out. So this type of coat, let's say the hayik, they will wrap themselves in it until they reach the destination where they're going, which should be another house most of the time, before they're able to take away all this. And there was no COVID-19 then, but they covered their faces. So it has nothing to do with the pandemic. But so that was addressed. Now, French, all this was prior to the colonization of Morocco, but continued throughout the colonization, because again, I was born after the independence of Morocco, and I'm telling you things that I have seen. The photo before is actually of my great grandmother, who is standing here and sitting on the other photo, from my mother's side. And the reason why I chose this is because my great grandmother from my mother's side is from a completely different socio-economical background, yet a city woman. But the difference between her and my grandmother is the fact that she has been more independent, if we speak in our terms today, than my grandmother from my father's side. And the reason is not that she has chosen to be independent. It's because she had to rely on herself. She was widowed at a young age, and she had to take care of her granddaughter, my own mother, who was an orphan. And she was not working because no woman was working. She was always home. But then when her husband died, her children took all the heritage and left her without anything. So she had to rely on herself. And my mother, who was, I think, about 15 then, decided to be working in order to protect her grandmother, who took care of her. So this woman was traveling by herself until she was 100 years old. You would think I have good genes. I do, but I also have some bad genes in between, because my mother died at a young age and her mother died at an even younger age. So I'm struggling which genes I like to keep, but guess which ones I prefer. So this great grandmother is a woman who I have seen, and she was the one who took care of us because she lived with us. The other one lived 2 blocks from us, but this one lived with us when we were children. And she really was like a grandmother for us, not only for our mother. And she was completely different. The first one that I spoke about seemed to me when I was growing up as a woman who does nothing. She's boring, she might be bored. I didn't, when I started, when I was a teenager, I found that her life was miserable, that she was always home, she did nothing. But in fact, bit by bit, I got interested into understanding all this and finding that the one who was the less lucky is this one, the one you see in the photo, because it's the one who did not have the decent man around her to take care of her like my other grandmother had. She was the one who was obliged to go out, who was obliged she was doing embroidery and selling it. She was doing beautiful embroidery. She would put henna on the hands of brides so she would get some money. She had to find, and she was so independent that she would not stay too long with us in our house, with my parents. She would stay for a while and then she would realize maybe she would be a burden. And then she will disappear in the next morning and go visit a son or a daughter in another town and then come back. She was an amazing person, very strong and an extremely stubborn woman. But she had issues with men. You could tell that she had issues with men. And her issues is that you can never rely on a man. And that was very interesting. It's because she actually had this issue. This woman was going out more often than the other one. And instead of wearing the haik that I just showed you, you can see another haik in the city of Rabat during colonial time, she was actually dressing like this. This jalaba is the dress of city people in Morocco up till today, but it was a men's dress. Only men were wearing it. They would not cover their faces, but they were covering their heads. And women adopted it during colonial time when the resistance against the French started, when France was under the Vichy system in the 40s. The Moroccan men were taken to the military to fight the Nazis with the French because they were part of the colonies of France. So several women were either widowed or did not have a man to rely on, or had men being jailed because there was also the resistance against. So there were those who resisted the French colonization, and there were those who were taken to help fight the Vichy system. So therefore, there were more and more women who had to rely on themselves in order to make a living. And those women dropped the former dress, the haik, which was a wrap that you saw, into the man jalaba, but kept the covering of the face. So when you saw in the 40s, 50s, up till the 60s, women dressed like this, it meant that these women were in fact replacing the man's role. But gradually, my grandmother also dropped the former dress and started dressing like this. So we started seeing the jalaba, especially after the independence of Morocco, as the national outdoor dress for both men and women, as a nationalistic dress, which for many Moroccans meant the moment where both men and women came together to fight colonization. And then in the 60s, we started seeing the very few educated women working. Interestingly enough, when your work was linked to education, or when you were a student, you could uncover your face, because education, knowledge, and religion were linked. And there was a religious saying that said that if when you are seeking knowledge, you don't hide your face. On the basis of that saying, so you could see this woman, she's in the classroom, she's uncovering her face. And you could see the next generation wearing what we call the Western costume, because the dress that you wear in the US or in other countries, or that I wear personally myself, is not the Moroccan costume. The Moroccan costume is actually what my grandmother was wearing inside her house, or what this teacher is wearing in the classroom. Those are the Moroccan costumes of the city. In the countryside, it's a completely different story, because Morocco is tribal. Every tribe had its own costumes, so colorful, so different. But the costume that made it, because of during independence time, is this djellaba. Up till today, most people do wear it, even if sometimes they drop it. And then you started seeing, you can see, working woman with her djellaba, and riding a bike. This is in Marrakesh. And here in 1956, when just after the independence, women were going to school, you could see the variety of dresses here. Some of them are wearing the Western costume. Some of them are wearing the djellaba. Their faces are uncovered. Some are also, I don't see it in this photo, but in other photos, they could be wearing the djellaba without even the hood on their head. So things started changing bit by bit. And that's when my mother's generation came in. You could see this one, the one who doesn't have the veil over her face, is from a younger generation than the other one. And then you could see the styles changing depending on where you are from. I know that these two women are coming from the north, because of the way they're tightening their veil over the face, and the way they're tightening their hood, and how the djellaba looks like. So it's just details. And then something happens. In 49 actually, the king of Morocco then, Morocco is a monarchy, I didn't mention this, but the king of Morocco then, who is the grandfather of the present king, decided that the women from the elite, or the women from the aristocracy, should unveil. So they started it from top down, even if in reality they were already, the younger generations were already wearing the Western costume. So he decided that his daughter, who is from the elite, would be given a speech on his behalf to actually introduce education, but also a form of modernity to the Moroccan women of the elite, who would have been the most difficult to open up. Speaking to my grandmother and women of her time, but even my aunts, my aunts from my father's side, why would people look at me? My grandmother was not only completely covered and veiled and staying home, but my grandmother would not meet with a stranger, with a male stranger. You had to be from the family for her to meet with you if you're a man. My grandmother did not meet with my own husband until I was pregnant. Then he became a member of the family, because we were going to have a child who would be her great-grandchild. So because she would consider herself to be from the elite. So it's a very interesting process. If the king allowed his daughter to uncover her face and give a speech, he actually was speaking to those who considered that it was, excuse me, that it was diminishing to actually uncover your face, or speak in public, or talk in the presence of men. So that's Lalla Aisha. She was a princess. This is just to show you a few photos of people from the countryside. This is a woman from the southeast of Morocco. These are women from the north of Morocco, the countryside also. And so the first revolution was a little bit from the top, from the king. And then the second revolution happened with my generation. Remember, it's the best generation. But in my generation, you had my grandmother not going out. And then you had, just after my grandmother and after the independence, few women going to school, women having to go out because they needed to replace the absent men. And then gradually, when Morocco got its independence, the governments and the people ruling thought that after the French left, the women will go back home and we will live like the time of our grandparents. And it didn't happen. So we were harassed in the street. Women were harassed in the street. They were reminded that their place was the kitchen, etc., etc., etc. But it was already too late. Women were out. In the time of my mother, few women were working. I'll speak quickly about my mother, but few women were working. But again, everybody looked at the women working as the needy ones. When my own mother, who was an orphan, um, uh, she got education. She was educated. The reason why she was educated is because her grandfather and her grandmother wanted her to be able to rely on herself. Because as an orphan by then, it meant that no one would want her. No one would want to marry her. And marriage was considered still to some extent today, but very much then as a protection for women, because you need to have a man to support you. You have to have a man to give you away. She didn't have that man. And then her grandfather dies, and it was even worse for her when she actually was educated and was able to move from her town to another town and meet my father. And they dated at a time where dating was almost inexistent, and decided to get married. And they were from two completely different backgrounds. Of course, the grandmother I showed you in the photo was shocked, but then she loved my mom, so it wasn't a big deal after that. But she was shocked in the beginning, when my father said that he wanted to marry her. Big problem for my mom. You have no man. You don't have any uncle, any grandfather, any father, any brother. No one to give you away. So the laws in Morocco were very archaic and did not follow the changes that women were undertaking. And therefore, for her, she had to go through um, a clause where she would have to have 12 male witnesses, because in the past, people were living in the same tribe, they knew each other. So there will be 12 male witnesses from the tribe who would know who is her father, etc. In her case, she was already in a different city, but the clause was there, so she chose to use it in order for her to marry the man she had chosen to marry. In the case of my grandmother, there was no problem, but she did not choose anything. Her father and her uncle chose for her. But for the case of my mother, if she got education, it's because she needed to get education in order for her to have a personality and a presence. And if she did not find a husband for her, no one would have found one for her. So the arranged marriages that existed in the time of my grandparents and parents were only for those who were known, whose family was known, whose origins were known, not those who had no family, like my mother. So for those, they had to do things for themselves. So my mother married the man she had chosen to marry. In other words, in the modern days, that's the right thing to do. You select someone you want to marry or live with or whatever. But in her case, it was not a modern thing. There was nothing to do. I mean, that was the only solution for her. I mean, they were happy, it's all fine, no problem, but that's how it was. In the time of my mother, few women dropped the djellaba and started wearing the Western costume. In fact, in my generation, I grew up wearing the Western costume because I was going to school. So in my mind, if you're going to school, you wear the Western costume. In the time of my mother, it was a transition. Some were wearing the Western costume, some were still wearing the djellaba. But in my time, in high school and in mid school and in primary school, everybody was wearing the Western costume. And we did not question all this. Then I go to the university. I was 18 years old. And at the university, while everybody in the first year was wearing the Western costume and no one was covering their heads, we started seeing in the whole university a couple of women wearing what is called today the hijab. The hijab, the term hijab, was never used when I was growing up, but it started somehow being heard as something that's coming maybe from Iran. The Iranian Revolution had just happened in 1979. Maybe again, it's something bad because everything that comes from Iran is still considered bad. Maybe it's something political, etc. But in fact, talking to these women who were wearing the hijab, which is the head cover that we see. I'm sure you see it also at your universities. And I'm seeing here a woman in the streets of Rabat in the Medina wearing the hijab. So in Morocco, very often when it started in the 80s, women were wearing the jalaba with a scarf tied like the hijab. Today, there's a mix of Western costume with the hijab, jalaba with the hijab, different types of costume from any country, as long as people are covering their whole body except for their face and hands. And the hijab, when it first started in the 80s, it actually was having a definition that was quite interesting. Well, again, it's the perspective of women who started wearing the hijab in the 80s that I am giving you. What I'm trying to do is no judgment, but the perspectives of those people, giving you the perspective of my grandmother, the perspective of my mother, the perspective of the women who are wearing the hijab. These women said, I am not able to change anything in my country. As a woman, I don't have rights under the family law, which is marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance. I can't change anything. I don't have the right to select a husband. I have to have a man. I don't have the right to work unless the man, whether my father, my brother, even my son, has more rights than me or rights over me, to give me permission to have an ID, to have a passport, to go to work, to study, anything. It has to come from a man. And therefore, they realized that through a certain interpretation of the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, they are able to find ways to elevate their status to the male status when it comes to the worshiping of God. By wearing my hijab, I am answering God's order for me to dress in a certain way in order for me to enter the space that is man's space, the streets, on an equal footing, to go and pray in mosques, to be able to go to school. By doing this, I am in fact imposing myself as an equal Muslim believer to the man. Whether the country wants that or not, whether the laws of my country accept this or not, it's a different story. But at least for me, I consider that the hijab has helped the Moroccan women move quicker into taking the streets, into going to school, into being able to do things that were once for men only. So it really helped going quickly, thanks to the women who are wearing the hijab. So when we see it as a religious symbol, it's also very often a feminist Islamic dress. It is a dress where the women will tell you, I want the man to speak to my mind, not to look at me as a sex object when I'm walking in the streets. I want to impose myself as an equal to him. And when I was going to the university, we were very often harassed by men, by the boys, by the guys with us in the classroom. Every time we would raise our hands or have a discussion in the class, to the extent where we would not say anything. Not a single woman wearing the hijab would have been whistled at by a man in the class. Not a single, then in the 80s, not a single woman would be harassed wearing the hijab, would be harassed in the streets by the man. Things have changed, and I don't want you to get me wrong. Things have changed, and the banalization, the hijab became something very normal, it's yet another dress, and it does not necessarily symbolize what it did symbolize when I was growing up and when I was going to the university. But when it first started, it was for my generation something extremely impressive, how these women were able to impose themselves in such a way that in fact they made all of us gain so much thanks to their behavior, their attitude, and their dress. Um, what else? I just want to show you today's photo today of different types of dresses. So you could see those who are wearing the hijab, the woman who is wearing this dress, and this is not a hijab because you can see her arms. I mean, even though she's covering her head, but she's not, it's her style. Here you have a young woman who is wearing jeans, but is not covering her head. So you are seeing, this is Morocco. You're even starting to see more and more women playing sports with their hijab, which only the elite was able to do in early days. So the hijab became an equalizer for women to make them do whatever they want. Nothing stopped them surfing or you know, and then women continued in the religious path. I mean, it's not that it stopped them, but in the time of my grandmother, as I told you, women were not even taught how to pray, let alone to go to mosques. The mosques of Morocco were not open to women. But today, there is no mosque that has been built in the 80s and after the 80s that does not have a space for women. It could be outside, it could be behind the men, it could be in the sides, it could be upstairs, it could be a different room, doesn't matter. But in the past, women did not have space inside the mosques. It was exclusively for men. So I'm showing you again, this is a photo in the countryside. I just felt that it's important for you to see. We are seeing more hijab in the countryside, but when it first started, it started at the university among the educated women. It then spread to given power. In the last 15, 20 years, we started seeing more and more women enrolling in literacy courses in order for them to erase illiteracy. And when you ask them why you want to do that, 95% of them tell you, because I want to be able to read the Quran, to pray, take care of my children, help them in homework, and be able to read the doctor's prescription. Interestingly enough, that's why they want to be literate. So in the countryside, again, you could see the diversity that you have, and you have more and more hijab, which was an urban dress and which became an equalizer. This is women then were able to become artists. This is arts in the southeast of Morocco. These are artists singing, and they are from a tribe near Rabat. And then this is a small town in the north of Morocco where a wedding is taking place, and the neighbors decided to be dancing in the street, some of them with their pajamas even, which was unheard of when I was growing up, for instance. And now and men and women, you could see them mixed, which is again something that we were able to do. Now, I think it is important to also speak about what are and I will end up in a minute, to tell you also what changed in this country. Few things changed in the up till the 90s, and those things were family planning in Morocco in 1961, which is one of the first countries to have adopted, in the region, to have adopted the family planning. We've seen the first women, the first police women, we've seen the first women pilots, we've seen women in the military, yet women did not have the same rights as men. They still don't, but they didn't have any rights. And then the Iranian Revolution takes place and the hijab appears, and the fear that Iran is going to be again being followed by people even in the non-Shia world. And the present king, who became king in 1999, made few reforms in Morocco. The ones that are the reform that I will focus on is on women. So he made sure that some of the laws for women change. So for the first time in our history, in 2003, women were able to issue an ID card without having to have a male consent, to be able to travel without a male consent, to be able to get to marry or divorce as they wish, to be able to work without asking for the men's consent. Of course, the culture is still there, and sometimes it's because of cultural understanding that we cannot do certain things, but at least some of the laws changed. I'm not saying that we solve our problems. I'm just saying that gradually, from my grandmother time to now, there's been so much covered, and to tell you the truth, yet so much to be covered that we have not reached yet, because we are having women in politics, but it's still under quota. And we're trying to get rid of that quota and make it, there are very few women in politics. There are, but there's still very few. We have mainly women who are working with no diploma, but they're active. We have also the, we are trying to change the religious interpretation of some of the, in fact, cultural laws, but we are always claiming that they come from religion to make them difficult to change. We have still very high percentage of illiteracy in this country. Almost 50% of women are still illiterate in this country. Yet, this is a country of contradictions, as I said in the beginning. 60% of women are in the School of Medicine. 70% of our pharmacists are women. And women have taken religious sphere also, making decisions. And for the first time in our history, women are able to be, to play the role of the notaries who sign marriage contracts, which was considered a man thing only on the basis of a certain religious interpretation. To the extent that this summer, my daughter got married, and it was a woman who signed her marriage contract. It's a civil marriage, because in Morocco, we don't have, in Islam actually, there is no religious marriage, even if a lot of the laws are followed by religious rules. Challenges. Domestic violence is still existing. The women's rights are still to be reinforced. Maternal health is still a big issue in this country. Education and illiteracy, as I said. Extremism, religious extremism, is still a problem because it interprets against women. Unemployment for everybody, especially the young people, but women too. Discrimination and sexism, because of the culture and because men consider themselves to be threatened. I'm not trying to justify, I'm trying to understand. I'm not trying to do that. I'm going to stop here and to open up to questions. I'm going to stop the sharing the screen. And I'm here for questions.
Great. Thank you so much. So if anyone has questions and want to unmute themselves and ask them, if you prefer, you could submit them to chat. But let's continue our conversation together.
I just hope it was helpful and clear for everybody. So I mean, just for the participants, if there is something that was not clear, or you want me to go back to, or explain further, or answer some questions that you might have, even about myself, I'll be happy. I'm very open about this.
Hi. Hold on. Let me turn on my video so you can match a face with a voice. Hello. First of all, thank you very much. That was all very incredible to listen to. I guess I was just wondering, so you were describing the differences between how your paternal grandmother would dress and act, and how comfortable she was just being in her home. and that you would visit her frequently, but that you also grew up wearing more of a Western costume, if I understood you correctly. So was that ever a point of conflict between the two of you, where she kind of, I don't know, didn't agree with that decision and maybe told you as much, or how is that all going down?
Just realized I unmuted myself. Okay. Yes, this is an excellent question. And actually, so much discussion with my grandmother. You know, when you become a teenager, you know, all the problems you may have. So I had issues with my grandmother. Of course, I was not able to, you know, argue with her as my daughter would with me. It's a different generation. But at the same time, for my grandmother, she was somehow proud that I was studying, that I was getting education. I think she never said it openly, but I felt that this was something that she was like, oh, I wish I could read, you know. But she never was happy about the way I dressed, especially in the time when I was wearing miniskirts or shorts. I was mainly miniskirts more than shorts, but she was very unhappy, and she would look at me and she'd say, why do guys look at your legs? Why do you display your legs to men? For her, it was this problem. Why don't you hide them? And so those were the discussions, because for my grandmother, I actually lowered the social status of women in her family because I dressed the way I dressed. That was the meaning. The meaning for her generation was that the more covered you were, the higher your social status was. The less covered you were, the lower your social status was. So I think she had more problems with me because I was the daughter of the sun. Again, this patriarchal thing in their mind, than with her her granddaughter from her daughter's side, because she had a different last name. It's a very interesting thing. So I'm kind of, you know, I'm the lineage, the real lineage in her mind, and I'm doing something wrong. Then I marry someone who is not from the family, because for her, my father made a mistake by marrying someone not from the family, but she was hoping I would correct the mistake by marrying someone from the family. So I will keep, it's like keeping the understanding, the purity somehow. I think it's in the mind of them, it's the purity of the blood. It's very for them. But in terms of dress, my grandmother was furious about the fact that I did not cover even when I married. So this man let you work. Why? What is he good for then? Why do you work? If you're bringing money home as a woman, you are either a prostitute for my grandmother, or you are a country woman, which means lower. And it's quite interesting for me. It made me want to understand why, and that's why I tried to study all this, because it was a very interesting approach. While for my great grandmother from my father's side, it's the reverse. Don't let the man work and you stay home. Don't stay home. Don't let him give you money. Because she had issues with the man. It's her life. She had issues with the man. She discovered after her husband died, my great grandfather died, that actually he was a polygamous man, and she didn't know. So the big shock, she thought she was the only one, she was unique, and all of a sudden there was another heir in the family, and she felt betrayed. So she was betrayed by a man. Don't trust the man. So each one of them had a different story, and because of their stories, they're kind of trying to, you know, influence you. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think.
Great. Farah, there's a question on the chat. Natalie is wondering if you can characterize the effects, if any, of the Arab Spring in Morocco.
Yes, and there was another question. I found everything to be explained. Oh, okay, very well.
That was
Thank
a
you.
compliment.
I just sorry. Thank you. Okay, yes, actually, the Arab Spring in Morocco was not as strong, I would say, as it was in other countries. And I think personally that the reason is that in the case of Morocco, and like in Egypt and Tunisia, especially those two countries, because they were the first ones, the leaders in those two countries were the age of the previous king. I think if our previous king, the father of the king we have now, if he was still alive, Morocco would have had the same Arab Spring, the same effects that happened in Tunisia and Egypt. But our king was young then, when the Arab Spring happened. The king had become king in mid-1999 and had initiated several reforms. And for 5 years, we as Moroccans were so happy with everything he had done. And then in 2003, we had our September 11th, our bombings of Casablanca. And in the name of security, a lot of things changed again. But for the first 5 years of that king, we as Moroccans loved him. I mean, we still like him. I mean, it's not, but we loved him so much because we were seeing the changes that were happening, among which the women's rights. I mean, it changed so much for what it was then. It's not enough today. We need to do more. But then a lot of things changed in the benefits of the Moroccans. Therefore, when the young people went out in the streets of Morocco, they did not request the king to leave. They actually asked the king to take away some of the people around him who were corrupt. And they were telling him, we trust you. We want you to do the revolution for us. So basically, I think the timing of the Arab Spring was in the benefit of the king. It's true that it happened at a time where there were less reforms happening, but because he was able to do the reforms earlier, people trusted that he just needed a little push to actually make the reforms as he was able to do. We trust you, you could do that. Just go ahead and continue. The type of young people who went out in the streets in Morocco were very different from the type of young people in Tunisia and Egypt. In Morocco, it was the middle upper class who would discuss on Facebook. It was very interesting. That's how I got a Facebook myself. It's because I wanted to see what the young people were about. And it was interesting that they were discussing the timing when they will go out in the street. And because it was on a Sunday, they would, we want to stay, we want to wait. We don't want to have our meeting in the street at 10 a.m. It's too early. Let's do it in the afternoon. When you're that desperate, like in Egypt or Tunisia, you spend the night in the street. It did not happen in Morocco. I am not saying that we don't have issues that may require changes and reforms. I'm not, to the contrary, we do have issues. But I don't think that at the time, the Moroccans felt that desperate during the Arab Spring. We've had more issues happening after the Arab Spring that require attention and where people may. The second reason, I think, why it did not happen the same way, Morocco is a country where demonstrations happen on a daily basis. Even during the COVID-19, we've had demonstrations in the streets. For us, it's a common thing to go out in the street and see people demonstrating and stop and look at them and ask, why is it going? It's unemployment, it's disability, it's freedom of speech. So I think for a lot of people, it's yet another demonstration. The Arab Spring was, again, yet another demonstration. I don't think people feared this much. And the third reason, and that will be the last, the King of Morocco responded very quickly. 2 weeks, I think, or 3 weeks after the demonstration started, he gave a speech on television and promised a referendum to actually see how many people want to have a parliamentary monarchy. Because the constitution changed. We did not have the parliamentary monarchy, even though he promised it. We did not have it, but it calmed people so much. Again, on Facebook, people saying, we love you, our king. You understood us. This is what we wanted. It was a very interesting thing to see. So he calmed the people, and in the negotiation with the different political parties, they ended up changing the constitution, reducing the king's power, but again, having a constitution that could lead to different interpretations. I hope I answered the question of Natalie.
Thank you very much. It was very insightful. And I'm thinking of studying abroad in Morocco for a semester, so that was also very helpful.
Good. Okay.
Thanks, Natalie. Emma is wondering today, what are some of the common reforms that people are pushing for in terms of women's rights?
Well, one of the same things that a lot of countries are pushing for, the right for abortion. Women want to have the rights for abortion. Inheritance is one of the big problems, because in Morocco, some of the laws are still based on a religious interpretation of the Sharia law. And few of them, especially the inheritance, is a big problem. In other words, a sister does not inherit as much as her brother. So for instance, my brother would inherit twice as much as me from both parents when they die. Now, it has an explanation. There were suggestions of reforms because things had changed. In religion, it said that the one who is in charge is the one to take the 2 shares instead of 1 share. In the past, it was a man, so the man should get the 2 shares. One is for him, and the other one is to take care of dealing with the inheritance issues, but also to take care of, if the father was polygamous, the mother and the stepmother, or the grandmother, if the grandmother was still living, etc. So the whole idea is that the one who is in charge, who was basically the man, would be getting his share for himself and the other share to deal with what the father was not able to complete. The truth is, no one does this. Everybody takes the 2 shares and 1 share, and that's it. Now, one of the reforms that was suggested by Muslim scholars, including women scholars, which is a very important addition in Morocco, was to revise this into looking into every family and seeing who in fact is in charge. If it's the woman who is in charge, then she is the one to get 2 shares. And of course, the man did not accept this. So there's still discussion about whether we should do like it's done in the West and have people write their testimonies, or whether we should have half or whatever. So there's still big discussion about it. And to the extent where it was brought to the parliament. So the good thing that is happening in Morocco is that a lot of the laws that were considered to be sacred are now taken to the parliament to be discussed. That is positive, because then you humanize those sacred laws and you make them more accessible for discussion. But we are not having, real solutions. So abortion, inheritance, polygamy is still an issue, even though, because they did not abolish polygamy in the change of the family law, they made it almost impossible to happen. So yes, the numbers went down, but it does not mean that men and women are equal if we still keep polygamy. It means that the man could still do it if he wanted to. But a woman could get a divorce if she doesn't want to be a co-wife, which we call a co-wife. So there's so many other rights that women should take. Some of them have to do with the laws, but a lot of that have to do with the culture. And I think, to me, as long as women are not educated, both men and women, not only women, but both men and women, as long as we don't have education for all, we're not going to be able to solve those problems, because you are speaking to an audience where people are not getting the same tools to analyze and choose. If I have to decide on abortion, and I don't have the tools to, to say whether I'm with or against, anyone could tell me, well, this is against God's will. Okay, then I'm not going to do it. And therefore, you're influencing people on the basis of whatever you want to pass. So I think education is very important, and it's the main right that I believe women should get.
Thank you. Grace is following up on that question and wondering if there's a difference between urban and rural areas on those desires for rights.
Yes. The majority of women who are not educated are unfortunately from rural areas. It's unfortunate. However, there are certain things that have changed in the reality of the way people live their lives. So for instance, I'm telling you, we don't have the right for abortion, but there's so many women who are performing illegal abortion in Morocco, and we've had statistics showing this. We've had, we've had a lot of issues because of this. Legally, you can't, but in reality, it's happening, even in the rural areas. So it's very interesting how rural areas are kind of now getting to following the cities. However, rural areas are missing a lot of the infrastructure that you can find in the cities, because in the cities of Morocco, and Jeff has been there, the infrastructure seems to be quite modern in many places. But you also have, that's the big contradiction in Morocco, but you also have places in the country where people don't have running water, don't have electricity, don't have roads, that are cut from everything when it snows. And it does snow, just so you know, it's quite cold these days, and it does snow on the mountains and in those villages. So some of the basic rights in the countryside are not there. So sometimes when you're talking to a woman in the countryside about the right for abortion or the right for inheritance, the woman looks at you and like, what are you talking about? I want food. I want healthcare. So it's the basic things that they need, and I understand that. So it's very difficult to bring everybody around the same table and to discuss those rights. I know it's true everywhere, but I'm just saying that here, besides the fact that we're different and we might have different ideas, there is the fact that we are not having the same basic, that the basic needs are not there. The basic things that everybody should have are not there to be able to have a discussion. So their desires have to do with basic food and shelter and heat when it's cold. People have a hard time. I mean, some people are dying because it's very cold, and that's unfair. I mean, or are not able to have a hospital in order for them to deliver their babies in decent way and with dignity. And infant mortality is still quite high because of that. And maternal health is an issue more in the countryside than in the cities.
Thank you. Any other questions before we wrap it up and say thank you? You see that? How acceptable
this is an excellent question. Thank you. Thank you to all of you, by the way. But the education in Morocco is mandatory for everybody and free of charge in the public system. This is an important thing to say. However, it has not been enforced for several reasons. First, we did not have enough, we still don't, but we did not have enough schools, even in the cities and the towns, let alone the countryside, up till the last 20 years. So this king has put more emphasis on enforcing education, we must admit. I mean, there are certain things that we've had and they were quite good. Yet, so we've seen in the last 10 years, I think, we've seen 95% to 97% of children in the age of schooling going to school. So we've seen really a lot. However, they don't necessarily stay in school. There's a moment where people do drop. There's more in high school, then that's good, than in mid-school, but they are, the number in mid-school is growing because of teenage and because of the culture where people, especially in the countryside, feeling that they don't want to let their daughter walk 4 miles before she reaches school because it's dangerous. They're concerned about sexual assault. They're concerned also about the fact that some girls, there were a lot of surveys that discovered that young women don't want to go to school because of lack of bathrooms, for instance, or private bathrooms for women separate from men. So there are certain things that they don't, the people who are making decisions are not aware of. And I think not only because they're men, but because they are city people. So they're not thinking about what are the needs of the countryside. So education is free of charge all the way to PhD. I've had free education at the university. I did not in before because my parents had chosen the French school for me, but I had free education. A lot of people have a very small grant, so they are able to pay for their room and board, etc. You have a lot of things. The supplies are being distributed, books are being distributed for free. So all this is fine, but the problem is the rest. I mean, the environment, how do you walk to school? Do you have transportation? Do you have, it's so many other things. Do you have prospects for job, for work, etc. So there are other challenges, but education is free of charge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farah, for being here with us today. I hope that you all, as participants, experienced what I experienced last year when I was in Rabat, this sort of flipping upside down of all of the things I thought I knew. And I so appreciate those moments and appreciate you being here and delivering this lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope this was helpful for everybody. If anyone has further questions, Jeff, and you want to send me an email, please do. I'll be very happy to answer as much as I can. And no, thank you, everybody.
And of course, our hope is that we can return to immersion projects next year. And so those of you as participants can look forward to learning so much more by participating in the Morocco Immersion Project in the future.